Hey, what's going on, guys? Dottz here, and today I'm bringing you my ESO PvP tier list for the Lost Depths patch. So the way that I'm going to structure this tier list today, talk to you guys about what classes I think are currently the best for PvP and PvE, breaking it down between stamina and magicka, is we're going to be covering it in 3 different categories, because I personally find this patch to be very unique in the regards that certain classes really excel in certain areas and are really weak in others. And I don't think that just simply doing an overall tier list will tell the full story of the way that this patch is in terms of classes power. So the way that I'm going to break this down is we're going to do a damage tier list, a tankiness tier list, and then I'm going to kind of pull it all together in an overall tier list. Again, this is mostly going to be from a solo small scale open world perspective. This is not a group tier list. This is not a BG's tier list. This is primarily an open world, like I said, small scale tier list. Now, I just also want to give a couple of small disclaimers before we get started today to hopefully cut down on some of the comments. Just because your spec is low on the list does not mean you can't find success with it. I've played a Magicka Dragonite for a really long time. We had a couple of patches in the sun, but for the most part, we've been pretty weak, but I've still been able to find very good success in ESO as a Mag DK. So if, you guys play a different class and it ends up being low on the list, doesn't mean you can't find success. It just means it might be harder to find that success. The second thing I want to say is that, of course, you can make a niche build that maybe moves the tankiness of a class. Like, let's say I rate your class low and you go, well, my build is hella tanky. Well, I think if you maybe make a niche build where that is possible, you're probably suffering in the damage department, and so then your damage on the tier list will probably be lower. So yes, niche builds do exist, but I'm speaking more from a general perspective about what you'll see from most people in Cyrodiil. Just because you made a full tank build for a low rated tankiness spec doesn't mean that the class is necessarily inherently tanky, because you sacrificed everything else to make that happen. And then the final thing is that this is all just my opinion. Just a guy that plays a lot of Cyrodiil and does enjoy it. So this is all just my opinion from the first couple of days of Lost Depths and the testing that I have done so far, and kind of just what I've seen out and about playing. So kicking things off, guys, let me actually move my my actual list over here so I stop looking off into the distance away from the camera. So we're going to probably start from the bottom up, and we're going to start with the damage tier list. So lowest on the tier list for me this patch is going to be Magicka Templar. The jabs nerfs really hurt Magplar. The class is really struggling. It's just not in a good place because of the jabs changes. Jabs has been a staple Templar skill for a really long time, and a lot of power of the class was baked into that skill. And I think if you combine that with the changes to Burning Light, the offensive potency of the Magicka Templar has drastically gone down. And I think because of that, of all the classes that I've dueled and even tested myself, my Magplar definitely feels some of the lowest in terms of the overall damage department. And I think that's going to transfer over even more into the open world. And personally, I fought a lot of Magplars this patch, and while they may be tanky, and that will be represented on the tankiness tier list, they do feel really lackluster in the DPS compartment, especially when you compare it to the other classes this patch. So I do think Magplar, unfortunately, got the old Zoss double dip when it comes to nerfs, with, again, that double nerf to Burning Light and to jabs really hurt the Magplar's offensive potency. Now, similarly, I'm going to put Stamplar just a step above it in my C tier. I just think Stamplar's feels a little bit stronger just because it does have access to the overall stamina kit, where I just feel like you generally get more damage. And also, I feel like the tankiness tier list will kind of play a role here, because I do feel personally that Stamplar is a little bit tankier than Magplar overall, and because of that, Stamplar can afford to budget for more damage, while Magplar I don't feel can. And so that's why, in my opinion, Stamplar does end up dealing a little bit more damage than Magplar. Still not great, but definitely more than Magplar. Now, what you're going to find with most of my tier lists for this patch is that most classes actually are in the middle. There really isn't a lot of outliers, in my opinion, this patch on the top end or the bottom end. A lot of classes are really closely grouped in these A, B tiers, in my opinion. So moving on to our next damage class, we are going to have Magicka Nightblade as the first class in our B tier. By the way, the classes in the tiers are not organized by order. They're just all going to be on the same tier, so it's not like the first one in the B tier is going to be better than the other ones. Magblade is going to be a B tier specifically if you play a melee Magblade. If you play range Magblade, it's going to be very low. Unfortunately, I think range mag blade has kind of been like axed with the changes to dark cloak and to rapid regen, and so you kind of have to play your mag blade like a, you know, stand blade from wish.com. So it just ends up not being as good as stand blade. The damage is definitely still there though. I mean, ganking is still very potent, and you can, you know, build a really strong, you know, damage spec with mag blade, obviously at the cost of some tankiness. But it's just not as good as stand blade. So for me, it just kind of reside in this B tier here. But the damage is definitely still very solid if you do play melee, because concealed weapon is very good now. So because of that, I do think that combined with, you know, the good assassin's will procs will easily land your mag blade melee specifically in your B tier. Now I'm going to talk about these next two classes at the same time. I'm going to put Stamcrow and Stamden in the B tier for damage. Stamcrow and Stamden are both like really similar, I feel, in the damage department, just because they kind of have the same strategy. You know, D-swing into Shulk / Blast Bones, into Dawnbreaker, into Execute. Now, the damage is definitely there burst-wise, but the consistent damage is non-existent. That's kind of like the kiss curse of playing these two classes, that you have really high burst, but really low consistent damage, and then the burst is obviously a lot more telegraphed. I would personally like to see maybe, especially I think the Stamcrow of these two classes, maybe have their tankiness lowered a bit and maybe incorporate a little bit more damage, because the class is just, again, the damage is okay. It's nothing crazy that like I would want to write home about, but the tankiness of these two classes is just really, really, really high. But you know, again, these two are both really similar. Your D-swing, burst, Dawnbreaker classes. It's really strong for open world. Obviously, it has a little less potency in duel due to the telegraph nature of the combos, but in open world, where you're fighting, you know, pugs and regular people and big groups, the AoE capability of these two classes to lay down big burst, very strong, can land you a lot of kills. Where the Nightblade is going to be pretty much all single target, these two can lay down that damage in an AoE fashion, which is why I think they're very solid. They're not as high as some of the other classes this patch, but the damage from them is going to be very solid. Now, moving into my A tier, we are going to put both of the DKs in A tier. I think DK damage overall feels pretty good this patch. It's not as good as it used to be. Obviously, we did get nerfed a good bit going into this patch. I do think DK in particular, the only way I would say we do really have A tier damage is if we do wear Balorg, specifically on my Mag DK. I feel like without Balorg, my damage is really not there. Stam DK is a little bit different. I feel like Stam DK doesn't feel as reliant on Balorg to find success, but for Mag DK, it definitely does. But I do think that the thing with Mag DKs and Stam DKs that would prevent them from being S tier or being really good was the unnecessary nerfing to Searing Heat. I feel like if Searing Heat was left alone, it would have been a lot better. Simply just due to the fact that Dottz in general got nerfed going into the patch, and then to also nerf Searing Heat, it's like a double dip on dot nerfs on a class that's supposed to be focused around dot. So I kind of really don't like that for the DKs. Especially like the whip changes, it felt kind of weird. But even with that being said, DK damage is still very respectable. It's still in a very good place. By no means complaining about it. Just some things that could be slightly improved, but we still have okay, acceptable, consistent pressure. The whips, though, still bring a lot of damage, especially if you combine it with leap or corrosive. So for those reasons, I still do think that DK is going to be an A tier offensive class. It is very, very, very good still, even with the changes. Now, this next one might surprise certain people, depending on how long it's been since you played the Elder Scrolls Online, but Magden, easily an A tier damage class this patch. Magden is very, very potent, and in my opinion, is a bit better than Stamden offensively this patch, just simply because it isn't as reliant on D-swing. I know me personally, I play my Magden with like the Vampire spammable, if you might want to do it differently, but Magden in general, with the changes to just with the changes the class got overall, but I think especially with the change to Bird of Prey, it gives Magden a little bit better skill slot efficiency. And so because of that, you're able to slot skills that are going to augment your damage a bit further and just make you way more potent offensively. And if you combine that with just all the other buffs that Warden as a class got, Magden feels really, really good. When I was doing like my testing for my different classes and updating my website, the Magden really shocked me like with how much damage it put out. And the people I were testing with were even saying that like the Magdin, like outside of my Mag DK, which obviously I have the most experience on, the Magdin was the class that they were the most scared of, which is really interesting. Survivability is also really, really good, which we'll get into in the next list. But Magdin is actually a really solid class this patch. I think, like I said, better than Stamdin because it doesn't need, it doesn't really utilize D-Swing, which is a bit bleh. But Magdin, very good. Definitely recommend it. With all the buffs it got, it lands itself in a very solid slot. Major and minor breach on Shulks helped. Being able to get a lot of debuffs with like Fetcher Infection and stuff, and also have the minor vulnerability up. Being able to have better slot efficiency for and not needing to run a movement skill. It gives you access to more damage. I personally use Lotus Blossom to get easier access to Prophecy, which then gives me more flexibility with my potions. It's just kind of like this ripple effect where just Magdin feels a lot stronger just due to the buffs that it got. So easily an A tier damage class this patch. Now, my next one is going to be Magic and Necromancer. I do think Magic and Necromancer overall has higher peak damage than the Stamp Crow, just simply due to the fact that the bombing build that Mag Crow has pretty much become the new staple for Magic and Necromancer. You don't typically see the non-bombing builds anymore. If you play a non-bombing build, then your damage is going to be down there with Magplar. But if you're playing like a normal stereotypical bombing build, your DPS will be very high. You could still explode big groups. Even with the nerf to dark convergence, like you're mostly doing your go with your ultimate anyway. So it doesn't really matter that DC got a nerf because now it just, you know, still aligns with your ultimate. So the peak damage of Macro is still absolutely insane. You go for those bombs in open world. They're still very tanky as well, making them a solid open world class. So for that reason, I'm going to put Macro damage in the A tier. The final class that I have for my A tier is going to be Magicka Sorcerer in the damage department. Mag Sorcs are scary when it comes to the damage, man. Overload hits really hard. Now, you will see the other side of Mag Sorc when we get to the survivability tier list, but at least for me, in open world so far, I've only been scared of 3 specific specs when playing in open world. Gankers, Mag Sorcs, and Stamp Sorcs, which we'll get to in a second. When Mag Sorcs and Stamp Sorcs build, and I'm just going to put Stamp Sorc on my S tier, and we'll talk about that in a second. When Mag Sorcs and Stamp Sorcs build for peak damage, it's very scary. I do believe that is kind of what makes Mag Sorc and Stamp Sorc a bit hard to play, because you'll see with the survivability tier list, they have to sacrifice a lot to make that happen. But if you build for that peak damage, your damage with your overload combo is incredibly scary. It's really freaking high. And I do personally feel that Stamp Sorc damage is a bit higher, simply because like part of what makes Mag Sorc damage so high is that they're pulling from the Stamp Sorc kit to make it happen. So for that reason, like I find Stamp Sorcs to be actually a little bit scarier. They're like one-shot, one-hit combos just feels like a way more potent than a Mag Sorc. Like the Mag Sorc will feel like, you know, the damage kind of builds up and then it catches you. But like a Stamp Sorc, when you're fighting them, you'll be fine, full health, chilling. They'll streak in, go for their wombo, and your health just evaporates. So these guys building for full damage this patch, they have the sauce. The damage is really high. And so if you do play a Sorc, I would highly recommend building for like all-out damage, because your class really does shine in that department this patch. And they just do feel really potent. And then my final offensive class for the S tier is going to be Stamina Nightblade. Stamina Nightblade is always a really good open world class. Oh, it's a really good pub stomper. Just deals a lot of damage with concealed the weapon / surprise attack. Of course, the bow proc coming out. You still have all that great mobility for being a stamina class. Plus, you got shade access and being able to do the verticality and everything. And just you can just bring out so much burst instantaneously with Incap the bow. It's really strong at taking down and picking off single targets. And just still, Stamblade gankers are still extremely potent this patch. Thankfully, not as crazy as it was the last couple of patches with the Kalurians ganking. It does seem a bit toned down. But even with that being said, a really high damage Stamblade will rival a high damage Stamp Sorc in terms of offensive capability. And similarly to Stamp Sorc, this does have the movement and defensive capability to escape. But speaking of defense, we are going to start to cover that into our defensive tier list. All right, guys, so now moving into our defensive tier list. Our first class, or I guess our first two, is going to be what I alluded to in the other list: Mag Sork and Stam Sork. Mag Sork and Stam Sork feel very interesting this patch in the regards that their damage is through the roof, but their survivability is through the floor. It's very, very, very low. And it actually makes, in my opinion, Stam Sork and Mag Sork two of the hardest classes to play this patch, simply due to the fact that it is like the peak representation of a risk-reward playstyle. If you play it really well, you will blow people up, but if you make one mistake, you will find yourself very quickly dead on the floor. Wards just don't feel like they have nearly as good a potency, especially with max stat becoming less and less important in the game overall. For the Mag Sork, definitely does feel really struggly. And just with Stam Sork, I feel like the issue is that if you don't build full bananas damage, then like you're not going to really kill anybody. And so you kind of have to go that way. And then if you do that, your survivability takes a hit. But I feel like with Stam Sork, you know, you do have the mobility and just being super fast to kind of work at your disposal. But again, it's got to be played really well, and if you make one misstep, you're gonna get killed, and you're gonna get killed quickly. So to me, I do feel that these two classes are the lowest on the survivability list. They're just very squishy, and you know, definitely very hard to play currently in the meta game at the moment. My next C tier class actually for survivability is going to be Magic and Nightblade. Magic and Nightblade got hit really hard with the survivability going into this patch. Rapid regen getting basically gutted really hurt Magic and Nightblade. Dark Cloak getting gutted really hurt Magic and Nightblade. I know for me, like, I've needed to go back to the drawing board with my Magblade. And you're pretty much going to need to play Magblade as melee nowadays. The way that you would build Magblade for range is kind of like dead now just because of the changes to Rapid Regen and Dark Cloak. And so you're going to need to play it like a, you know, budget Stamblade and play it like that, because if you don't, your survivability just isn't there. Still higher than the Sorks, yes, but still not great. The Dark Cloak nerf really hurt. Really, really, really hurt. And you just don't have the same mobility that Stamblade brings. You know, you just don't. And so I think because of that, like, yeah, you're more survivable than a Sork, but your survivability is still not great. Now, our B tier is going to be very crowded. This is going to be a very crowded tier for defensive capability, with our B tier classes being Mag DK and Stam DK, starting off with the DKs. Mag DK and Stam DK still do feel relatively tanky in the current meta. Coag is still really, really solid as a heal overall. We do, though, however, need to use Vigor. Rapid Regen is basically Kaputs. It's no longer really good as a solo heal. And I feel like, especially like Mag DK, you do definitely feel some strain on your stamina nowadays with needing to use Noxious, Vigor. You need to use Molten Whip. You're definitely straining your stam a bit. But the classes are still fairly beefy. They are. You know, you might be going, oh, well, Dottz, B tier, what the heck? Don't get too caught up on like the letters. It's just I needed to put these two classes and a bunch of other classes on B tier, because there are two classes that need to go into the A tier above it, and then one class that needs to go into the S tier. And so for me, it's just easier to just say B, because there's classes that I think are above it. So the survivability, though, is still good. Do not get me wrong. Their survivability is still great. But, you know, it definitely is not as good as a couple of the other classes. But again, you're going to see that B tier is really, really crowded. So alongside of these two classes, in my opinion, are also going to be Magdin and Stamdin. The updated Arctic Blast was so good for Magicka and Stamina Warden. Really, really, really helpful for like defensive healing. So like it allows you to get an instantaneous stun when you're healing yourself defensively, which is absolutely huge. It's a lot. And plus, now that it scales off of your weapon and spell damage, oh, the heals from it are juicy, especially if you combine it with Malabeth. Got Leeching Vines, got maybe Lotus Flower, you got Vigor. Like, your heals are really high on Magdin and your class and Stamdin, and the class is just really beefy. It's, you know, feels really similar to DK, where you just have a lot of good like recovery potential. You know, one of the oofs I think a little bit with Mag DK in particular is Burning Embers does still feel a little bit lackluster. It's good to have still. Like, I tried Venomous and I was like meh on it, you know, because the heal from Burning Embers was still kind of nice, but you know, overall, like it's not as good as it was in the past. But the Wardens feel beefy. They really do feel beefy this patch with the changes that they got, and it's good to see Wardens get some love. And similarly to DKs, they're definitely pretty tanky this patch, and you're going to have a really good time surviving on them. My last two tanky classes are also going to be Magplar and Stamplar. Stamplar, I do feel, is a tiny bit tankier at a base than Magplar, but if you build Magplar with some additional tankiness, it does feel a lot better. Personally, on my Stamplar, it feels just about as tanky as my Magplar if my Magplar is wearing like Danger Trickery or something, but my Stamplar is using double offensive sets. But unfortunately, like, especially with Magplar, the change to jabs just makes you feel a bit squishier overall because you're not outputting as much damage with jabs, therefore you're getting not as much healing with jabs. And so you just find yourself on both specs really relying on like Living Dark, Honor the Dead, Vigor, Rally, like those burst heals to just really keep you up and alive. And like, again, you're still beefy. Like, all these classes on the B tier are definitely still very tanky this patch. DKs are still really tanky. The ability to block, very strong healing with Coag. The Warden's Arctic Blast changes are really good. The Templars, I actually feel like Living Dark combined with the burst heals that they have, in addition to having Vigor now, is really good. But with that being said, there are 3 classes that, in my opinion, do stand above, and it's part of why I put all these classes on the B tier, even though I do consider them pretty tanky. Necromancer is just so tanky. It's just insane. Like Spirit Guardian, Mortal Coil, Resistant Flesh, Resolving Vigor, the amount of healing and passive damage mitigation that this class has is through the roof. Combined with the fact that your healing over time is really strong and you have a passive that reduces dot damage, it makes your healing over time even more effective, you know? So it just makes, in my opinion, like, part of the reason I put all these classes in B was not because I don't think they're tanky. I actually think all 3 of these classes are very tanky. It's just that the Necromancer as a whole is tankier. You know, it really is, with the amazing healing package that the class has access to. It's, in my opinion, I think especially Stamcrow, I would love to see Stamcrow and even Magcrow to an extent have their damage adjusted up and their tankiness adjusted down. Because I would love to see like a Magcrow build that isn't just like the bombing build become a little bit more viable. So I do think that, you know, again, Necro is just one of the beefiest classes in the game, but Stamblade, still in my opinion, the king of open world survivability. You just have Cloak and Shade. Cloak and Shade give you so much effective tankiness. You can't really quantify it on a stat sheet, you know, because I know people might go, well, dude, you can't say it's tankier than a Stamcrow in a duel. But again, this is for general open world solo small scale. And the thing is that the Nightblade has unparalleled mobility if you compare it to the Necromancer. You know, being able to, again, shade Cloak and have the ability to just kind of bob in and out of combat at will is a really valuable thing to have. Especially Vigor is a lot stronger now, so you have a really good heal there. You have access now with the hybrid scaling to some of the Magicka heals, with the burst heal with Minor Mending, which will then make Vigor stronger, as well as Rally. I just think that Stamblade has really strong survivability if played right, and the mobility is really what highlights the survivability from the Stamblade. You know, I think mobility is something that people do undervalue a lot of times, because it's not like oh, look at this resistance, or oh, look at this damage, but mobility really, it can cause you to take no damage if you really get around a corner or something, or use Z-axis movement really well. And that's just something that Stamblade really just has in spades. So for that reason, I do personally put Stamblade as my S tier survivability class. All right, guys, so that brings us to the final part of this tier list, my overall solo small scale tier list. Now, starting off again in our D tier, I'm gonna have to put Magplar. Part of the reason I put Magplar here is just simply due to the fact that it does not have the damage this patch. It really doesn't. Sure, yeah, you got some survivability, but your survivability is just as good as Magdk, StamDK, Magdin, Stamdin, Stamplar, but you just don't have the damage that those classes have. And so it's kind of like one of those situations where it's like, well, why would I play a Magplar if I could just play one of those other classes? The nerf to jabs and Burning Light really hurt Magicka Templar a lot. especially with jabs being a heal. It also hurt the defensive capability of Magplar quite a bit. And so because of that, I do feel that Magplar needs to build a bit more defensively compared to Stamplar. And so because of that, Stamplar feels in a better place overall because you can just budget for more damage, which just, again, makes you better for open world gameplay, in my opinion. So for that reason, I do personally think that Magplar, which is crazy to say, is sitting on the bottom of my tier list for my overall solo small scale. Coming in on my C tier here is actually going to be Magicka Sorcerer. Magicka Sorcerer right now is just worse than Stamina Sorcerer. Wards just do not have nearly the same value as heals right now, and obviously Magsork is hugely about the shields and whatnot. Even though a lot of people are starting to completely move away from them. But I feel like once you start to do that, Stamsork just becomes a lot better. Stamsork's damage also feels a bit higher, and so, like, because of that, it's like Stamsork's damage is a little bit higher than Magsork's, but their survivability is, like, roughly the same. And so because of that, I have to put Magsork in my C tier because it just isn't as good as Stamsork right now, in my opinion, if both classes are built for peak damage. I don't know. I just don't feel like in open world they're doing well, which is so weird to say because Magsork's been crazy strong almost the whole time I played ESO, but they're definitely in a very, very, very struggly spot right now. And so for that reason, they do kind of reside in my C tier at the moment. Stamplar is going to be chilling it in the B tier right now, simply due to the fact that they have solid tankiness and like okay damage. They are not great, but they're not worse than a Magplar or a Magsork. It's kind of why they're in the B tier. They're okay. They're all right. You know, you bring okay damage, decent survivability and mobility. So yeah, they're just I think like the epitome of like a very average class right now. You also have Stamdin, in my opinion, in your B tier. Stamdin is going to bring really strong burst damage with basically non-existent consistent damage, and then you have really strong survivability. I feel like overall the Stamplar probably brings slightly more consistent pressure, but the Stamdin's peak burst feels a bit higher in my opinion, just with that wombo combo that you can bust out with them. So the Stamdin's damage overall feels a bit higher, with the survivability definitely I think being, I would say about on pace with Stamplar. But Stamdin, very solid class right now. Definitely brings it in on a B tier for me. My next class is also going to be Magicka Necromancer as a B tier, simply just very similarly to the Stamdin. Very, like, they have like one thing that they do really well, right? The bomb. But like outside of that, they don't really do much, but the bomb is very potent, similarly to how with the Stamdin, the big burst one shot is really, really good. But Stamdin and Magcrow's got bonkers survivability. The Necromancer kit just has so much tankiness built into it. And so even though Magcrow is a bit of a one trick, they have the survivability to be a one trick. And so they do reside in that B tier because the one thing that they do well, they do very, very well. I would love to see Magcrow have a more viable build outside of the one-shot bomb, but for now, this is what they have. Also bringing it in on my B tier is going to be Melee Magblade. Again, Range Magblade is a Q tier. It's not good, but Melee Magblade, to me, still does have some potency in the meta, just because, again, a really high damage build coming from stealth can still rip people apart. And again, you do have Cloak and Shade to promote some survivability and allow you to move around. However, because you don't have the same level of mobility as a Stamblade, that is like one of the biggest things preventing Magblade for me from being higher on the list. They just don't have the same level of survivability that Stamblade does. And so for that reason, Magblade is just going to have to reside in my B tier for kind of like missed survivability, but still very solid damage. Bringing it in on the final rank on our B tier is going to be Stamsork. Now, Stamsork, I do think is a B tier class with a good pilot. Stamsork is a very hard class, in my opinion, to play this patch, simply due to the fact that, again, it's like I said, it's the epitome of that risk-reward playstyle where your damage is insanely high, but if you misstep once, you will be finding yourself pressing respawn and you will be dead. So for that reason, I do think Stamsork does have some good viability right now, but it is a very hard class to play. Bonkers damage, shit survivability, and so because it's got one really high point and one really low point, it ends up being a pretty average class in the meta right now. So definitely a solid choice though. Bringing it in as the last class in my B tier. Now, starting out our A tier is going to be the Stamina Necromancer. I do rank Stamina Necromancer a little bit higher than Stamina Warden personally, just because I feel like in terms of offensive potency, they are roughly the same. But I just think that for open world, Stamcrow having the Defile is really valuable. And also, I don't know. I just feel that Stamcrows are they're just tankier. That's like one of the biggest things that does it for me. I would say like Stamden damage and Stamcrow damage are about the same, because again, they try to accomplish the same goal. D-Swing, Blast Bones, Shulks, Dawnbreaker, Execute, right? The combo is like the same. They're really similar in terms of their offensive goals, but you know, Stamden's got a little bit higher peak burst with Major and Minor Breach, with Stamcrow having a little bit more consistent pressure with Defile. But I just feel that the considerable survivability that Stamcrow has just ekes it out a little bit more above the Stamden, and that's what puts Stamcrow in A tier for me. The class is just so fucking hard to kill, especially if you have somebody on it that really knows what they're doing. You are going to have a very hard time killing them. So for that reason, it's just an A tier class for me. Very good burst, albeit it is a bit telegraphed, but their survivability is just absolutely bonkers, and it makes them, and again, you know, the telegraphed nature of it isn't as much of a big deal in open world. So I do think for that reason, Stamcrow going to be an A tier class for me. Also bringing in on my A tier is going to be both DKs. Makes me still happy to say this as a DK main. DKs are still very, very solid in the meta right now. Their survivability still feels great, especially with the changes to Vigor. I have started running Vigor, I know, on my Mag DK after seeing what the tooltip looked like on my Stam DK, and it adds a nice level of defensive comfort to the Mag DK. If you take like Vigor, Coag, Burning Embers, and Shattering Rocks, you get like a really nice like healing package on the Mag DK. And the changes to Race Against Time allow you to kite a little bit better. You're not as reliant on Vampirism. It's a really, really solid class to be, or solid patch to be a DK. Your damage still feels there if you do budget for it, albeit the consistent damage is way lower, which makes me very sad. Molten Whip, though, if you do combine it with a really good Balord leap into Whip, you can still get some really big burst. I know with my Stam DK specifically, I built more of for a corrosive build, which still does work very well for the Stam DK, and I have enjoyed it. But Stam DK and Mag DK overall feel very similar to Stamcrow in the regards like they're very tanky and they deal very solid amounts of damage, and that makes for a very, very good open world class. And so because of that, the DK easily going to be in my A tier. And now it's crazy for me to say this simply due to the fact that of how bad this class has been for a long time, but Magden is easily an A tier class for me this patch. I think if you have not tried your Magden yet, maybe you're a Magden player and you've benched him for a while, it's time to bring him back out, because the Magden is very, very good this patch. I do personally put it up there with the Stamcrows and the DK, simply due to the fact that the tankiness and survivability of the Warden feels pretty similar to DK to me. The changes that I think the thing I can't possibly touch on the most is just the change to Bird of Prey. Like, Bird of Prey changing really opened up one skill slot, right? And that was huge for both Stamden and Magden. It just gives you more flexibility with skills to run. You can get either more damage or more survivability, and then other parts of your build can adjust because now you have more of something out of that last skill slot. But I do actually feel that with Stamden being more reliant on D-Swing can crowd up your bars a little bit with some of the abilities that you need to slot, while Magden does not have that reliance. And so because of that, I feel like the slot efficiency on Magden is a bit stronger than Stamden, which ends up, from my testing at least, the Magden ends up feeling like it deals more damage. And so because of that, I just think that Magden is a little bit above Stamden right now. Survivability across both classes feels roughly the same, but I do personally think that Magden damage is a bit higher, and the Magden is really fun this patch. Like I said, I've said on stream, if my DK didn't exist, I'd probably play a Magden. So Magden, very good right now. Definitely a good time to pick it up. And then finally, the S tier class for me is still going to be Stamina Nightblade. Stamina Nightblades have just been the king of open worlds for a really long time, and I don't necessarily feel like that has changed. They have really good single target burst damage, very good survivability with Cloak and Shade, very good mobility being a stamina class. The Stamblade just really has everything you could possibly want as a solo small scaler. Of course, they start to fall off drastically hard when you start talking about you know, like PGs or group play, but for like solo small scale or ganking or something like that, like when you're playing by yourself or in a very small group in Cyrodiil, they're really strong because they just bring everything you could possibly want to the table. Even though if you look at the stats, like on paper, they may be less tanky than a Necromancer, a Warden, a DK, of course, right? They have non-stat sheet tankiness. You can't like quantify really the tankiness that comes from Cloak and Shade because they're mobility, you know, or basically removing yourself from combat. And those things, those very unique properties of the Nightblade, specifically Stamblade, are what make it so potent, especially if you combine it with just the general mobility of being the stamina class. And so for that reason, Stamblade for me is going to be my S tier class for the patch, and this is going to be my overall patch ratings for the for PvP in Lost Depths. Now, once again, guys, this was just my opinion. I know this was a bit of a longer video than probably some of the other tier lists you guys may have watched, but I personally felt that to really get a good picture at this patch, you needed to break down, and I have to give a huge shout out to Annie for this idea. You really needed to break down the classes into damage and survivability, because if you look at something like a Magsork on C tier, you're like, well, why is Magsork on C tier? You know, that, you know, isn't their, you know, damage super good? I just felt like it doesn't paint a whole picture. And so, like, maybe you are someone, though, who's looking for a really high damage class. You don't give a shit about survivability. You might see Magsork on C tier and go, oh, well, Magsorks aren't good. But actually, I think Magsorks are very strong in damage, but what makes them kind of shit this patch is that their survivability is terrible. So it's just an example of why I think, like, doing, like, kind of like 3 tier lists where you do damage, survivability, and then culminating it overall paints a more accurate picture of the patch as a whole. But hopefully you guys did find this interesting and did learn something from it. If you have any questions about the tier list, about any of the classes, please leave them below. If you guys do need builds for any of these classes as well, I do have builds on my website, dotsgaming.com. You can feel to check those out. Basically, most of them are updated by the time that I upload this video. I still have a couple I need to update, but for the most part, most of the PvP builds are going to be fully updated. But yeah, Lost Depths has been pretty good so far. Definitely a step up from High Isle in the previous patch, although, you know, I do obviously have my criticisms, but, you know, that's going to be, we'll talk about that at a different time. But anyway, guys, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, I really appreciate it if you smacked a like on it. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. And of course, subscribe for more ESO and other MMO content. So thank you all so much for stopping by. I do very much appreciate it. As always, I'm Dottz Gaming, and I'll see you all in the next video.